Having a child is almost universally seen as a wonderful expression of someone's personal choice, an exercise in someone's autonomy to pursue happiness and meaning in the way that they see fit. But what if I were to tell you that having children is actually anything but a personal choice? Now, of course, even questioning the idea that having a child is a personal choice will be an affront to some. But if you stick with me throughout this video, I hope to show you by the end of it why it isn't. But I want to be clear, I'm specifically talking about procreation here, the act of creating a child. That's what's being discussed here. The points made in this video don't necessarily carry over to something like fostering or adoption. Now, there's probably only one question we need to remind ourselves of to really see how ingrained this assumption that procreation is a personal choice is. Do you want children? This is probably the most common question to ask someone when broaching the topic of reproduction. This question, whilst it may not always be asked by someone who necessarily views procreation as just a matter of personal choice, it frames the decision as to whether to create a child or not as being appropriately decided by someone's personal desire. This is shown even more when we look at what usually follows this question if someone answers it in the negative. Mara von der Lucht goes over this in her recent book, Begetting. While justifications are rarely demanded of the positive answer, yes, I'd love to have children, they are usually considered necessary for the negative answer. No, I don't want children. No? Why not? So, whilst this question is framed as a personal choice, it's actually interesting that there is usually an implicit burden of justification, not for the person who's chosen to create a child, but the person who's choosing not to. But before we get into this any further, I think it's about time that we get into the question of whether procreation actually requires a moral justification, or is it in fact mere personal choice? So, what does it mean for procreation to be personal choice or not? Well, what I'm not talking about here is whether someone can do something. Of course, we can all personally make the decision to procreate or not to procreate. What I'm talking about here is if procreation falls within the scope of morality and can be viewed or judged in that context. If something is a personal choice, then it falls outside of the moral sphere and would make no sense to view or judge it through a moral lens. All of our actions fall within or outside of the moral sphere. If something falls outside of the moral sphere, then it is just a matter of personal choice. If something falls within the moral sphere, however, then others need to be taken into account, and the action taken cannot just be considered a mere personal choice. A few examples of things that would fall within the moral sphere include killing someone, donating money to charity, or lying to get a promotion. A couple things that wouldn't fall in the moral sphere would be choosing your favorite band, or walking into another room in your house, or sitting under a tree. Essentially, what I want to show is that procreation, or creating someone, whilst it's often framed as a personal choice, actually falls within the moral sphere and therefore can be viewed and judged through a moral lens. So, how do we judge whether something falls within the moral sphere or not? Well, an easy way to think about this is how Alex O'Connor put it forward in his video, Homosexuality is Not Moral, and Here's Why. He explains that for an action to fall within the moral sphere, it needs to meet two criteria. It must be done consciously, and it must have an impact on other morally relevant individuals. To give some examples, he explains that raising his hand is done consciously, but it doesn't impact the well-being of any other morally relevant individuals. So as an action, it can't be judged through a moral lens. Likewise, if someone were to roll over in their sleep, that action also doesn't impact any morally relevant individuals, but additionally it was done unconsciously, and so definitely can't be viewed through a moral lens or judged morally. On the other hand, there are actions that do impact the well-being of other morally relevant individuals. Alex gives the example of sleepwalking in his kitchen and knocking over a glass of water that a housemate then later slips on. Now, this action obviously has impacted another morally relevant individual, but it wasn't done consciously, and so Alex couldn't have been morally judged for knocking over that glass of water. However, if he wasn't sleepwalking and he were to intentionally knock over that glass of water knowing that his housemate walks through that kitchen regularly, then hey presto, you've got an action that is in the moral sphere. It's both done consciously and it impacts the well-being of another morally relevant individual. Now, I can understand that some people may say this is a very simplistic way of deciding which actions can be morally judged or not, but I think it's sufficient to convey the message that I'm trying to in this video. I now want to go on to apply this framework to procreation and hopefully show you quite clearly that procreation does fall within the moral sphere and so can be viewed and judged morally. Now, edge cases aside, procreation is done consciously. People either intentionally choose to create another individual or they intentionally engage in sexual acts that carry a risk of creating a new individual. Of course, as I referenced, there are edge cases cases that complicate the moral landscape of procreation. For example, if you were to have two people that were cognitively impaired in some way, or maybe people who are underage that engage in a sexual act that leads to a pregnancy and a birth, it's not clear that you can really morally judge them for this, as whilst they have chosen to engage in this act, it's not conscious in the way that we're really discussing in this video. This is also why, for example, we wouldn't let these people drive or get a tattoo or vote or join the army, for example. Now, on whether procreation has an impact on another morally relevant individual, of course it does. Creating someone is the most significant thing you can do to another person. It exposes them to, or guarantees for them, all of the other things that we could point to say that those are morally significant. And it's also the case that creating someone can have impacts on other morally relevant individuals. Okay, but what if someone were to say, you say it involves someone else, but there's no one in existence before you've created them. It's what you do once they exist is what is not a personal choice. So let's take what this person is saying and run with it. What they're saying is that because the person you're considering creating doesn't exist at the point that you're considering creating them, you can therefore consider the act of creating someone as a personal choice and not something that you can morally judge. Would this apply to a case where someone has a hereditary disease that they know their child will inherit? Would that just be a personal choice on behalf of the parent to create that child? Would it not be a decision worthy of moral analysis? What about the case of someone who intentionally procreates in a war zone, for example? Would this also be a decision outside of the realm of moral condemnation or analysis? I think most people watching this would clearly recognize that these are two cases where there is warrant for moral discussion, and so they're not mere personal choices. It's irrelevant that the person being created doesn't exist at the point of the potential procreators considering creating someone, because they know that that person, once they exist, will have very real consequences for having been created. I think the only reason that someone thinks that they can get away with claiming that because their child that they may create in the future doesn't exist now, they get a blank check to essentially behave how they like, make any personal choice that they would like to, is because procreation is just so normalized and people feel entitled to it and are resistant to being subject to any level of moral interrogation. So how can we change the narratives in society so that procreation is viewed and discussed in a more appropriate and responsible manner? I previously mentioned Mara van der Luk's book Begetting. In one of the chapters in her book, she identifies 6 narratives that she believes governs the way that we view and discuss procreation. Now, if you want to learn more about these narratives, you'll have to read the book. I'll put a link in the description. But they range from framing procreation as a matter of mere personal desire, as we've gone over in this video, to something that facilitates growth in the parent, to an act that someone is entitled to take. I think a more responsible narrative or framing around procreation wouldn't center on the needs or desires of the potential procreator, but the interests of the potential child. What would it mean to them to be created? What are the ethical implications of creating a child concerning that child and the others that will be impacted by that decision? Rather than the central question that dictates procreative behavior being, do I want children? We should ask, is it morally permissible for me to have children? I think this could be called the permissibility narrative. This reframes procreation as something that requires moral justification, but it also ensures that the burden of justification is on the person who's deciding to procreate, not the person who is elected not to. Now, of course, people will come out the other end of these considerations with different answers, and we may be disgruntled at the conclusions that other people have made, but I think this fundamental reframing of procreation will only be better for society. It will help to ensure that less children who are truly not wanted will not be brought into existence. This will be better with respect to the possible child, but also the parent as well. It will also mean that children who are created after much more consideration than they otherwise would have been, in a world that doesn't have the permissibility narrative as the prevailing one around procreation. And I think this will be better for the children, as the parents going into it will have done much more consideration, and so presumably will have prepared more for when they are raising the child. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.